In 55 B.C.E., the situation in Gaul had been stabilized, but Caesar had even higher ambitions. He was going to invade Britain. The Romans knew virtually nothing about the island. It was on the edge of the known world, with one foot in the realm of myth. People disagreed over whether it was an island at all, or instead a massive unexplored continent lying just off the Gallic coast. Some said that it was full of riches, with gold and silver lying openly on the ground, and pearls on the beaches. There were stories about the souls of the dead being ferried across the channel, which led some to believe that the island itself was entirely fictional. But Caesar knew better. The Gauls conducted regular trade with Britain, and Caesar met with people who claimed to have been there. This is why Caesar had been so keen to eliminate the last shred of resistance in Gaul last year. It's also why he went out of his way to build a permanent base around modern Calais. This is where he planned to make his crossing. Everything was ready, but there were new developments. Two massive German tribes, over 400,000 people, began to cross the Rhine that winter. This is exactly the kind of thing that Caesar wanted to avoid. As soon as the snows began to melt, Caesar assembled his legions. Before long, he was marching to meet the German threat. His goal was to stop this before it spiraled out of control. When he got close, the Germans sent a diplomat. The diplomat told Caesar that the Germans had been forced from their homes by a much larger German tribe, and if the Romans could find them a place to resettle, they would commit themselves to being strong and loyal allies to the Roman people. This story didn't move Caesar at all. He wasn't interested in new German allies. He was interested in his expedition to Britain. He told the diplomat that Gaul was already filled to capacity, which wasn't really true. But, he said, there was a tribe on the German side of the Rhine that kept on asking for Roman assistance against invaders. If they marched to that tribe's aid instead, they would probably be allowed to settle in their territory when the whole thing was over. This was a pretty clever way to kill two birds with one stone, keep the Romans out of it, and stabilize the German side of the Rhine in the process. The diplomat took Caesar's offer back to the Germans. This was a giant decision, and they debated the issue over several days. While the Germans debated, Caesar took this opportunity to close the distance between them and his army. After a few days, the German diplomat returned, saying that they would agree to Caesar's plan, as long as they could get the tribe on the other side of the Rhine to swear an oath guaranteeing their safety. They would need a few more days to get in touch with them. So a few more days passed, and Caesar continued to close the distance. And then, something happened. According to Caesar, 800 mounted Germans ambushed Caesar's men while they were out foraging for supplies, killing a small number of them before running away. Personally, I have doubts that the Germans attacked first, but regardless, Caesar claimed that this only confirmed his worst suspicions, and that the Germans were only playing for time as reinforcements flooded across the Rhine. The next morning, Caesar prepared for battle. A large German delegation, including all of the tribal leadership, arrived at the Roman camp, formally apologizing for the sudden outbreak of violence. Caesar ignored their apologies and arrested them on the spot. Let's take a step back for a minute. Caesar crossed the line here. Remember why he went to war against the Veneti last year? Rome sent diplomats, the Veneti arrested them, and Caesar responded by going to war. This is exactly the same thing in reverse. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on anybody. When word of this got back to Rome, Cato denounced Caesar for violating a truce and committing a sacrilege. Cato suggested, half-jokingly, that the Senate should turn Caesar over to the Germans in order to absolve the city of sin. Nobody took him seriously. Back to Caesar. With the German leadership in custody, Caesar marched on the tribes and launched a full-out attack. The Germans were leaderless, and nobody was able to coordinate a meaningful defense in time. It quickly turned into a one-sided slaughter. Many Germans escaped, but were pursued by the cavalry all the way back to the Rhine. Some even tried to swim back to German territory, but were told that they all drowned. The Romans would later try to spin this as a great military victory, but let's be honest, it wasn't. It was Caesar needlessly slaughtering at least tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who were only interested in Rome's protection. But Caesar wasn't done. His fear was that persistent instability on the Rhine would jeopardize his expedition to Britain. He decided to take his army across the Rhine to punish the Germans, which he hoped would prevent any further incidents from derailing his plans. Some friendly Germans volunteered to ferry his men across the river, but in a classic display of that famous Roman arrogance, he calls this beneath the dignity of the Roman people. Caesar had his men begin to construct a massive bridge across the Rhine. Caesar describes the process of building this bridge in excruciating detail. I read his account, and it almost killed me. All you need to know is that the Romans got it done in 10 days, and people who care about this kind of thing think it was some sort of technical achievement or something. Anyway, Caesar placed a strong garrison at both ends of the bridge to protect it from attack. Then he marched off into German territory. But there was nobody there. All of the villages were abandoned. The tribes had been alerted as soon as Caesar began building the bridge and had fled into the woods. Caesar then marched all over the place, burning down every abandoned village he could find. Nobody would come forward to fight him. After 18 days of this, Caesar just declared victory, claiming that he had successfully scared the Germans away. But that wasn't really true. He didn't know this at the time, or maybe he did and he chose not to share it, but there was an army further into German territory ready to fight the Roman invasion. But the invasion never came. Caesar turned his army around and marched back across the Rhine. He then destroyed the bridge to prevent the Germans from using it in the future. Caesar had now wasted more than a month on the Rhine when he was supposed to be in Britain. The whole thing was a giant waste of time, and if we're being honest, it didn't accomplish anything. Well, it does give Caesar the distinction of being the first Roman general to lead an army across the Rhine. That's significant, and honestly that little piece of propaganda may have been the point of the whole thing. But now, Caesar was finally free to lead his expedition to Britain. He ordered his leftover ships from last year to move up to modern Calais, and marched his army up to the permanent base that he had conveniently built there. At this point, Caesar makes this radical claim that the people in Britain were sending supplies to his enemies in Gaul. This is almost definitely not true. See, the Romans had this funny attitude toward war. They always liked to frame their wars as defensive, even when they weren't. It's that Roman legalism, it makes you do funny things. Anyway, once the legions and ships and weak justifications were in place, Caesar was ready to launch his expedition. He only had enough transports to carry 2 of his 8 legions, but that was enough. He loaded his 2 legions onto the ships, and left the remaining 6 in Labienus's capable hands. The transports pushed off in the middle of the night, so that they would arrive off the coast of Britain by mid-morning. But the Romans were terrible sailors, and the weather in the North Atlantic was a lot more unpredictable than they were used to. Early in the morning, a storm whipped up, and a bunch of the ships lagging behind were forced to turn back. Unfortunately, these happened to be the ships carrying all of Caesar's cavalry. The rest of the fleet continued toward the island, and after the sun rose, the men on the ships saw this. The White Cliffs of Dover, a wall of chalk in places over 100 meters high, spanning 4 kilometers in each direction. This was literally the worst place on the entire island to attempt to make a landing. As the ships got closer, they could see people lining the cliffs. Native Britons, with their bodies covered in blue war paint, ready for battle. Those on foot wielded swords and spears with shields, but many were on horseback, and some stood on chariots. It must have been quite a sight. Caesar brought his ships to a stop. Obviously, he couldn't land here, so he had to figure out what to do next. After consulting with his subordinates, Caesar decided on a course of action. The fleet waited until the late afternoon for stragglers to catch up, at which point they headed up the coast to the northeast, searching for a suitable place to land. As they moved, the Britons on the shore shadowed them along the cliffs. Let's take a moment here and talk about how British chariots worked. One person drove the chariot while other riders threw javelins or other projectiles. The horses were very fast and were trained to turn on a dime, which allowed them to zigzag erratically or charge full speed at the enemy line, only to turn at the last second. All the while, the riders threw their javelins. When they ran out of projectiles, the driver would get down off the chariot with their sword or spear and shield and fight on foot. While they fought, the chariot riders made sure that they were parked just behind the line of battle, ready to leave at a moment's notice. If the fighting turned ugly, all they had to do was take a few steps back and they would be galloping away within a few seconds. Caesar goes on at length about how effective this tactic was. Anyway, for the rest of the afternoon, the Roman ships moved northeast, searching for a place to land. After many kilometers, the cliffs began to drop away, and they came across a suitable beach, but the Britons were still shadowing the ships. The infantry was having a hard time keeping up, but the cavalry and the chariots were doing just fine. When the Roman ships stopped, the Britons set up down on the beach, and every minute, more Britons caught up, joining their ranks. This would be a contested landing. The soldiers on their ships were not thrilled by this. Amphibious assaults were not really in their wheelhouse. The order was given to disembark, but nobody moved. After a tense moment, a man bearing an eagle standard came forward, and according to Caesar, he shouted, "Leap, fellow soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy. I, for my part, will perform my duty to the Republic and to my general." And with that, he jumped into the water, all by himself. This shamed his fellow soldiers, and within moments, everybody was jumping in after him. As they moved toward the shore, the Romans were subject to intense missile fire, and when they got into shallow water, the British cavalry charged. But the Romans held their ground, and the fighting continued. Caesar stayed aboard his ship and watched as the battle played out. Whenever spots in the line started to look like they were close to collapse, he sent a rowboat full of infantry as reinforcements. The fighting was rough, but the Romans absorbed the worst of it when they met the initial cavalry charge. As time went on, the Romans gained sturdier footing, and eventually a signal was given and the Britons withdrew. Remember, the Britons were mostly cavalry and chariots, while the Romans were all infantry. The Britons easily disengaged without much fuss. We don't get an exact casualty count from this engagement, but we get the impression that the Romans paid a heavy price. It was starting to get dark, so the Romans got to work. Caesar and the rest of the men came ashore, and the transport ships were pulled up onto the beach. Caesar moved some of his men onto solid ground, where they built their fortified encampment. They spent the night safely behind walls. As the sun rose the next day, the gravity of their situation started to set in. Caesar's cavalry hadn't made it, which meant that the Romans were literally in uncharted territory with virtually no ability to scout ahead. But almost immediately, things began to improve. Diplomats from a nearby tribe showed up, claiming that they weren't part of the army that had resisted the Roman landing. The diplomats came offering peace and surrendered hostages to the Romans as a sign of good faith. It seems unlikely that this tribe had nothing to do with the battle that just took place in their backyard, but Caesar wasn't really in a position to argue, so he accepted their peace offering. The weather was still pretty awful, so with peace established, Caesar let his men rest for a couple of days, while the supplies were brought down off the ships. Back in Gaul, they were also keeping a close eye on the weather. There were still a bunch of ships full of cavalry, eager to make the crossing. They decided to try again. This time, they were able to successfully navigate the storm. They found Caesar's camp and prepared to come ashore. But suddenly, the weather turned again and the fleet was pushed out to sea. Their ships were simply not built for weather like this. The fleet was scattered for a second time, and many of the ships were badly damaged. They barely made it back to the Gallic coast, and would not attempt a third crossing. This was some pretty bad luck, and it was about to get a lot worse. The Romans discovered that the ships on the beach had been knocked around during the storm, and some of them were so badly damaged that they were no longer seaworthy. Caesar and his 2 legions were now stuck on the island. The Romans had no scouts, very little food, and were surrounded by locals who only a few days earlier had tried to kill them. The first order of business was to repair the ships. Caesar scoured his legions for anybody with experience as a woodworker or a craftsman, and immediately set them to work patching up the ships. The second order of business was supplies. The craftsmen needed wood, and everybody else needed food. Foraging was possible, but without any cavalry, their range was severely limited. Each day, Caesar would send half of his men to fan out over the countryside and gather whatever supplies they could find. This was fine for a while, but with each passing day, they were forced to go further and further afield. It didn't take long for the locals to realize that the Romans were stuck. This dramatically changed the dynamic. In the dead of the night, the British diplomats and hostages slipped out of the Roman camp. The next day, while everyone was all spread out searching for supplies, a group was suddenly attacked by British chariots and cavalry. Some people ran back to the camp and told Caesar what was happening. When he heard that his men were under attack, Caesar immediately ordered everyone back to camp and told them to prepare for battle. He then grabbed 2 cohorts, around 1,000 men, and personally led them out of the camp. The men under attack were barely holding their own, but when Caesar and his cohorts came into view, the British cavalry and chariots turned and fled. Caesar didn't have any way of chasing them down, but in retaliation, he marched to the nearest village and burned it to the ground. It was becoming clear that the native Britons were becoming openly hostile, so Caesar kept everybody close for the next couple of days, while the craftsmen continued to repair the ships. Eventually, the Britons showed up again, this time with a large army. They had been spending their time forming a tribal coalition for the purpose of kicking the Romans off the island. Caesar had around 8,000 infantry under his command, so his options were pretty limited. He deployed his men in a standard line in front of the camp, and waited for the Britons to attack. The chariots zipped back and forth and threw their javelins. Then, the cavalry charged. The Roman infantry held their ground. After that, in Caesar's words, the enemy was unable to sustain the attack. They obviously weren't used to fighting heavy infantry. The Britons turned and fell back. The Romans, in a surprise move, surged forward and pursued them as fast as they could. The British cavalry and chariots were too fast to catch, but everybody on foot was killed on the spot. The Romans were now pretty fired up and spread out all over the countryside, where they killed any civilians they could find and burned their villages to the ground. The next day, the Britons sent diplomats again, acting all nice, talking peace. This looked awfully familiar. Even if Caesar didn't trust them, he was still in a precarious position, so he accepted their peace offer at face value. He also demanded from them twice as many hostages, which they agreed to. Around this time, the weather improved. His transport ships were frankly not quite prepared, but close enough. Under the cover of darkness, he loaded everybody onto the leaky, busted-up ships and pushed off around midnight, leaving a deserted camp for the Britons to find the next day. The first Roman expedition to the island of Britain was officially over. If you ask me, it was an unmitigated failure, and they were lucky to escape with their lives. First of all, they must have been disappointed by the level of poverty on the island. There were no secret riches, no gold, no pearls, nothing. Second, whatever Caesar's ambitions were for the island, I'm sure they weren't unify the opposition, barely survive 2 battles with them, and leave in the middle of the night with your tail between your legs. But these were fixable problems. If he had more ships, he could pack them full of cavalry, and if he made the crossing in the spring, he could avoid the late summer storms. Caesar resolved to return next year. During the nighttime escape from Britain, some transports were blown off course, again. One ship, carrying 300 soldiers, was blown deep into Belgae territory. When news spread that a battered, isolated group of Romans had washed up on shore, 6,000 Belgae descended on their position. The 300 Romans grabbed weapons, got into a tight group, and held their ground as the Belgae completely surrounded them. The Belgae told the Romans to lay down their arms, but the Romans refused. there was a tense standoff for several hours. The Belgae occasionally closed in and tried to take the Romans by force, but they were fended off every time. Late in the day, Roman cavalry showed up out of nowhere. Caesar had got word that some of his men were trapped in Belgae territory and had ordered every rider at his disposal to ride all day to come to their rescue. We're starting to see why Caesar's men would later become fanatically loyal. The 6,000 Belgae turned and ran, and the Roman cavalry pursued them. Many Belgae were killed, but more importantly, all 300 Romans escaped with only a few minor wounds. Caesar's right-hand man Labienus was becoming quite familiar with the Belgae, so Caesar sent him at the head of a legion to punish them for this transgression. This is the third year in a row that Caesar had been forced to fight the Belgae. He didn't want to have to fight them again next year, so he had his legions winter with Labienus in Belgae territory to keep an eye on them. Caesar returned to Cisalpine Gaul, and despite his lackluster results in Britain, he sent an account of the expedition back to Rome. The response was rapturous. Britain was still a magical place in the mind of the public, and they gobbled up every little detail. Bowing to public pressure, the Senate voted for 20 days of celebration in Caesar's honor. Even with all of his setbacks, Caesar's PR campaign was a resounding success.